Hello, this time on Sitrep.
We are holding this military parade to awaken our people's desire for peace.
They see this as an opportunity to send a message to Washington, D.C.
China's display of military hardware and personnel is one of the biggest in history. It's not just about what was on show in the parade, but also who was and who wasn't in the VIP seats. We'll explain what it tells us. Also on Sitrep, the government says it's close to a new plan for dealing with the legacy of Northern Ireland's troubles. We talked to the chair of the Commons Defence Committee about his discussions with ministers on how it could affect veterans. And the race to weaponise space. Just how much could it transform future wars?
Jamming causes a receiver to die, spoofing causes a receiver to lie.
They're making quite a play of these new lighter tanks. This shows that the Chinese are thinking about the ways in which the Ukraine war may be affecting ground warfare.
Defense Explained.
This event is to celebrate the victory over Japan and to some degree Germany. Yet America, Britain, France were not invited.
This is Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
More than 10,000 marching troops, 1,000 musicians, more than 100 different weapon systems, all in front of 50,000 spectators. Mike, China really does know how to put on a military show, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And it was all very nicely done and very perfectly rehearsed. There were also, in addition, there were 80,000 doves released at the end. Although I'm reliably informed that quite a lot of them turned out to be pigeons. But never mind. 80,000 birds were released at the end. And this enormous 90-minute parade of military hardware made its way down the Avenue of Eternal Peace. And I mean, that was the message, is that with China's dominance, the world will go to eternal peace, as long as nobody gets in China's way. So this was the sort of the underlying idea that the world has a choice between peace and war, they said, but China is preparing for war. It's preparing to take on anybody, and we can have peace as long as we all accept that. That seemed to be the underlying message, and this is China's moment. This is the Asian century, and this parade, I think, is a huge photo opportunity, but it will go down in the history of the 21st century as the moment when China said, we are ready for anything.
A good show is one thing, but what about the substance? Because we've seen China put on a big military display before. In terms of the parade itself, what was new to see? What hardware was unveiled?
Well, there were a whole series of things. So there were things that we would have expected to see, and then a few things in development. The point about these parades is that when you see things like, the new laser weapon, we knew they've got other laser weapons, and we knew they were developing this one. By the time they put it on the parade, that means that they think it works, that they think it's got to the point of testing where it is operationally available at some time in the near future. So that's what the parade tells us. And apart from that, I think the parade gave us a sense that they have an all-domain warfare aspiration. They can go to war in every domain at a very high level of sophistication. Now, whether that turns out to be really true, we don't know, and hope we never find out, really. But, parades are one thing, operations are another. But the parade tells us what they think is operational material ready to go.
Well, we are going to go through a little inventory right now, and nodding away watching you, Mike, we have a Defence and International Affairs analyst, Dr James Bosbotinis, who knows a lot about this kind of stuff. James, great. Welcome to Sitrep. It's great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
In terms of the new kit that was paraded, what was the most significant to you?
In terms of what was shown, it was all of it really was significant because it shows the progress China has and continues to make in its long-standing defence modernisation efforts, which is linked into its wider economic development. So that's given China the ability to actually invest in this broad-based, comprehensive defence development effort. The systems on show, you have obviously a maturing strategic nuclear capability with a demonstration of a triad for the first time with the new JL-1 air-launched ballistic missile, the JL-3 submarine-launched ballistic missile, which will go into China's next-generation ballistic missile submarine, as well as the new DF-61 intercontinental ballistic missile. You have all the hypersonic weapon systems, which those systems there widely expected. But it's also systems such as the various unmanned capabilities, the large unmanned fighter aircraft that was shown, these loyal wingmen type aircraft, the GJ-11, GJ-21 unmanned combat aircraft, the unmanned surface vessel, the unmanned underwater vehicles, as well as the unmanned ground systems. These are all showing that China is investing not just in the human element of its armed forces, but in what is termed manned-unmanned teaming or crewed-uncrewed teaming. And of course, in air power terms, the new air group for their first Catabar-equipped aircraft carrier, the Fujian. You had, for the first time flying, the catapult-launched aircraft, the different variants of the J-15, the KJ-600 airborne early warning aircraft, and the first carrier-borne stealth aircraft built outside of the United States, the J-35. So there is so much that you can look at and how it reflects long-term efforts in Chinese military modernization.
And if we can just go through those areas in a little bit more detail. On the missiles, how much do these new missiles show an increase in China's reach and capability to strike globally?
Yes, one of the missiles that's interesting is as James mentioned, the DF-61, which is an upgrade of the DF-41, and that's an intercontinental ballistic missile. So it's heavy, it's big, it's got a range of, 7,500 miles almost, and so it can cover everywhere. It can cover the United States, it can cover Europe, depending on where it's launched from. It's anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. So what China is demonstrating, which is what it's been showing in 10 years ago in the 2015 parade, and has done so since, it shows that it's got the heavy missiles that are equivalent to America's heavy missiles or even Russia's heavy missiles. But again, what's interesting about their missile technologies this time is that they're showing that they've got hypersonic missiles, which are particularly in an anti-ship configuration. This really puts the American fleet in the Pacific at risk. And we know that the Americans are pretty concerned about the DF-17, a very capable hypersonic missile, but the YJ-17, which is the maritime version of it, really does put at risk any big American battleships, cruisers or aircraft carriers anywhere in the Pacific. And they're very difficult to defend against. So the Chinese are making it pretty clear that they intend to have certainly equivalence, if not domination, in certain areas in the Pacific balance of forces with the United States.
And you were nodding there, James.
Yes, the YJ series of maritime strike weapons were a notable addition to the parade. It was the YJ-15, which is a follow-on to the existing and currently deployed YJ-12 supersonic anti-ship missile, the YJ-17 hypersonic glide vehicle, which will be launched from a variety of ships and possibly submarines, the YJ-18C, which is a subsonic missile, but a cruise missile incorporating low observable characteristics, and of course the YJ-19, which appears to be of a Wave Rider scramjet hypersonic cruise missile base configuration, and that is a notable system. And finally the YJ-20, which before it was publicly debuted, footage had been released by the Chinese a couple of years ago showing an unknown missile being launched from one of their new Type 55 cruisers. And it appears that missile was in fact from YJ-20. So this really, the combination of these different missile systems shows that China has invested in providing itself with a highly potent ship and submarine-based long-range strike capability. And you got in the parade, particularly in the fly past, an allusion to the investment that China has made in the supporting intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance platforms. The thing with these long-range conventional precision strike weapons is they depend on a robust supporting kill chain, because if you can't find, fix and track a target, it doesn't matter how accurate your missile is. But the Chinese have invested in that supporting kill chain. This really dovetails into the wider perspective on how the Chinese view their military modernization efforts. And like the United States is pursuing a joint all-domain capability where you have different sensors relaying information in real time to different shooters, the Chinese are pursuing their own equivalent of that.
And Mike, on the planes, how do they compare to what the US and its allies have?
Well, it looks as if they are very comparable in most areas. They're not as far ahead. I mean, the J-20 that was shown is pretty like the F-35, but is some way behind the F-35. But there is, their own version of the F-35 is certainly on its way as the maritime strike aircraft. So I think it's sheer numbers as much as the technology. And again, you look at, as James was saying, I mean, if you think about all the missiles on display, a lot of people jump to the conclusion, oh, well, that makes aircraft carriers are obsolete because they can all be hit by so many missiles. And yet, the Chinese are also building aircraft carriers. I mean, they're getting into the aircraft carrier business in a big way, which goes back to the idea they do believe in all domains. And there's a degree of imitation here. If the Americans have got it, then the Chinese want to build it. They want to build something very similar. And so the American force structure actually becomes a model with some variation for the Chinese force structure. And you see that in the air domain and the ground domain, I have to say, is learning a bit from the Ukraine war. You can see that the Chinese have absorbed the lessons of Ukraine and are changing some of the ground kit which they're displaying as being now operational.
And James, maritime power is harder to show off in a parade, but it was there.
Oh, absolutely. As I mentioned, was for YJ series of maritime strike weapons, there was an unmanned surface vessel, unmanned underwater vessels, an intelligent mine, and of course in the fly past the future air group for China's aircraft carriers, the different variants of the J-15, the J-35 and the KJ-600. And on the parade unit, for example, an unmanned helicopter system, which that was its public debut, but it's known to have been around for some years. And of course, the JL-3 submarine launched ballistic missile, which is part of China's strategic nuclear deterrent. Yes, China it's the largest trading nation in the world. Its economy is significantly dependent on the global maritime trading system. And it wants to protect that interest. So it's investing in broad-based maritime power, as Britain did, as the United States did, to protect those global interests.
And Mike, could you briefly just tell us what you think was the most innovative or surprising new tech on display?
Well, I don't know if it's surprising, but the one that amused me most was this the LY-1, the laser weapon. And the reason is this is a directed energy weapon, so it's a laser gun to you and me. And in the rehearsals, what we saw was this low loader with a big tarpaulin on top, as if they didn't want anyone on the rehearsals to see what was on top, and they unveiled it. Which is this big screen, a big blue orb on top. And I think there may have been a bit of kidology about this. I mean, the Chinese have been working on laser systems for a long time, and as everybody else has. And the advertised version of this thing, the LY-1, is that it's a very multi-capable laser gun that can bring down lots of drones simultaneously in a very complex environment. Well, maybe it can, maybe it can't. Again, the fact that the Chinese, as it were, had it on display must indicate that they think it's operationally ready. But I think there was a bit of kidology going on here because they wanted us to believe there was something very, very secret and important about it, that they had to keep it under wraps and then just reveal it for 90 minutes during the parade. That was the one that really rather amused me. And maybe it's the best laser gun in the world. It could be. But I remain to be convinced. And I'm not sure we're going to see much more of the testing of it in the near future.
And it worked because I remember seeing the pictures in advance of that big tarpaulin in the papers as well. Has the display changed your assessment of where China is as a military power at all? No. There
wasn't really any system shown that was a surprise. Even the DF-61, there had been a lot of murmurings on Chinese social media of a new generation intercontinental ballistic missile, possibly designated DF-51 coming. The air-launched ballistic missile, a large air-launched ballistic missile of unknown type, has been seen carried by an H-6N Badger bomber for some time. The hypersonic missile developments, not at all surprising. I was in Beijing in 2018 for a conference, and it just happened to coincide with National Science Week, and I visited the display for that at their military museum in Beijing, and they had on display for the first time a scramjet hypersonic missile demonstrator, the Lingyun-1. And I thought at the time, well, if the Chinese are willing to show in public something of that capability, then what are they actually developing in the black world? So not really any surprises, just a confirmation of their trajectory.
Yeah, it's an important point to make, and they're going to show us what they want us to see. Well, let's talk about the who part. China's got a lot of attention for having the leaders of Russia, North Korea and Iran alongside President Xi, but it doesn't feel very surprising in what feels like an increasingly them and us world, Mike.
Yes, it does. And this photo opportunity that it provided, coming off the back of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting over the weekend, was a real demonstration of the Asian century. And here were the big powers, I mean, three of them effectively at Shanghai. So Modi, Putin and Xi Jinping, and then Putin, Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Modi wasn't at the celebrations yesterday for very important reasons, but he was at the Shanghai meeting, or Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Tianjin earlier than that. I mean, here are the three of the big four powers in the world saying we are the future. And the United States is not the future. The Western world is not the future. And they're being as explicit as I think they've ever been in their statements, saying that we represent a new world order. Now, they don't tell you what that world order is, because actually it'll be a pretty chaotic and very conflictual world order. But they're making it very clear that the current world order, from their point of view, is now on its last legs. I don't think they're right about that, but that's what they think.
What did you think, James, when you saw those images?
Obviously, there's a degree of irony in talking about peace and defeating fascism, and you have Vladimir Putin standing there. But it's also worth remembering that if you pan out slightly, in that front row was also the Indonesian president, Prabowo Subianto. And Indonesia is going to be a power of increasing heft going forward in this century, given, as Mike has explained, we're looking at an Asian century. And there were also other states represented. A former Japanese prime minister was in attendance. The Singaporean deputy prime minister was in attendance. So, of course, President Xi wants to highlight that the era of the United States pursuing a unipolar hegemonic moment is over. And we're looking at a bipolar, some would argue a multipolar international system. But the emphasis on multipolarity, or at least the United States no longer calling the shots. And whilst having Putin in Beijing and Kim Jong-un, of course, I think the Chinese, they want to keep Kim Jong-un on as close a leash as possible, because they will be very concerned about the degree of the relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang. So it's not just Kim Jong-un is our friend, let's have him here. It's also, let's try to keep him on side. But they also wanted other representatives from around the world to show that, this isn't just us and a few friends. This is a more multipolar world. It's not just the US and its Western European allies dictating.
And Donald Trump, Mike, certainly focused on a handful of the guests. That online post of his saying, please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America. But just tell us a bit more about the significance of India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, after a very public souring of relations between him and Donald Trump, because he wasn't at the parade, is that correct?
Correct, yeah. But he was at the previous meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And he made a big point of going to that and walking hand in hand. They held hands with Putin. Putin and Modi held hands as they walked down the red carpet together. And so there was Putin, India's Modi, Xi Jinping of China, again, three of the big four in the world, all standing there in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization talking about the Asian century, the end of Western dominance and so on. And you have to say, whatever you think of Donald Trump's policy in the world, and so, some people support it, some people don't, his policy domestically, but his handling of India is really dumb. It is the stupidest, most inept form of policy that you can really imagine. It's dumb. Because, he needs Indian trade, and he slapped this 50% tariff on India now, 25% so-called reciprocal tariffs, 25% for dealing in Russian oil. He's cozied up to Pakistan, which is an economic basket case and a political basket case as well, whereas India is now the most populous country in the world. It's overtaken China. He has given Modi popularity at home because Modi has been indifferent to Trump's threats. Reportedly, the White House has tried to phone Modi on 4, maybe more occasions, and Modi won't pick up the phone. He won't talk to Trump. And so he's effectively humiliated Trump. And then Modi makes a point of going to stand with Putin and stand with Xi Jinping. And so these people that Trump thinks he gets on really well with, he gets on really well with Putin, he gets on really well with Xi Jinping, he's pretty good, gets on well with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, and he thought he had a personal relationship with Modi until relatively recently. And suddenly, the penny might just be dropping in the White House. I don't know. I mean, I've said this before, but the penny might just be dropping. That Trump's personal relationships with these people count for far less than their sense of what unites them in terms of their national interests. And they feel that their national interests between China and India, Russia, in this case also North Korea, their national interests are much closer together than anything that President Trump can do to indicate that he has a sort of backslapping man-to-man relationship with them. Those things that Trump puts so much stress on are trivial in world politics.
And James, a final thought from you. Seeing all this hardware, all those leaders who are not in our gang standing together, what message do you think Downing Street and the Foreign Office and the MOD will be taking from it all?
Well, I hope the message they would be taking, and build on Mike's point about Donald Trump and his absolutely unbelievably inept approach to foreign policy, is that all the post-Second World War assumptions guiding British grand strategy, that the United States is the guarantor of the international geopolitical environment, the international financial and economic environment, those are over. You need to invest in a robust defence policy aligned to British interests. You need to be pragmatic and base British foreign policy on protecting and projecting British interests. And that means working with like-minded states in Europe, in Asia. The Indo-Pacific and European security are inherently linked. Kim Jong-un's presence with Vladimir Putin highlights that connection. North Korean ballistic missiles are raining down on a European city. So for British policymakers in Whitehall, you've got to be pragmatic. You've got to work with allies. You've got to invest in defence and the wider tools of statecraft, because it's not just getting a military solution. You've got to have the diplomatic influence. You've got to have the economic influence. You've got to have that judicious blend of hard and soft power. And you've got to work on the assumption that the United States is not going to be the reliable ally that we've based the past 80 years of our foreign and defence policy on.
Dr James Bosbotinis, it's been great having you on Sitrep. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next, it is September. Children are heading back to school and MPs have just returned to the Palace of Westminster. Among the many answers they are demanding from ministers in the coming weeks is exactly how they plan to repeal and replace the Northern Ireland Legacy Act and what that will mean for veterans who served in Northern Ireland. The last government promised the act would provide them with immunity from prosecution, but that part has been challenged in the courts and ruled unlawful. On Wednesday, the Northern Ireland Secretary said the UK and Ireland are close to a new agreement on the way forward, but gave no real detail of what the new plan might be. Well, the chair of the Commons Defence Committee, Labour MP Tandesi, recently met with the Defence Secretary and Veterans Minister to discuss, in his words, a resolution to this complex issue.
We need to make sure that there is justice and there is support, in particular for our veterans. That's what they would expect of us. All of those involved in Operation Banner, their families, victims, people across Northern Ireland and beyond, and across the UK. And I know that there's a lot of interest also in the Republic of Ireland in this as well. So my request to them is that we need to have a solution that is legal. It also needs to be fair for all concerned. And I know that the government itself has a manifesto commitment to deliver on about repealing the previous government's Legacy Act and making sure that there is a better mechanism in place. It's how the Defence Secretary, but in particular the Minister for Veterans and People, Al Kearns, I know during my discussions with both John and Al, that it's important that they have that stakeholder engagement and ensure that they have a solution which is amenable to everybody, cross-party. When I say cross-party, I mean within Northern Ireland, because the previous solution, unfortunately, did not garner the support of any political party, I'm led to believe.
And what did the Defence Secretary and the Veterans Minister say to you?
They said a lot to allay my concerns, that they have been doing a great deal of work on this. They've been working closely with Northern Ireland Secretary Hilary Benn and his team to ensure that they are listening to everybody and to make sure that there is support for veterans. I think many of us are concerned that the previous solution, which repeatedly in our courts was found to be unlawful. We do not want that predicament facing our veterans and their families. And for me in particular, as chair of the Defence Committee, it's important that those who served our armed forces, who served our country with this distinction, that they and their families receive justice. Just as the former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace once said that the British Army is not above the law, and neither should it be. I fully agree with that point of view as well. And I know that there has been lots of concern with the previous solution as was proposed with the Legacy Act. And that is why we need to have a very serious and sensible approach to get to the right solution.
Yes, and is it a solution that everyone can be happy with? Do you think it's possible to reach one when the issues are so complex and the feelings are so high?
Well, look, we know that the feelings are running high, and they have been for some time. We just need to make sure that there is clarity and there is justice, and it is a long-lasting solution that has the support. I know that it is always difficult to get 100% support, but it's only by serious engagement with stakeholders that we can have a solution that is amenable, in particular to the good people of Northern Ireland. So that is why there needs to be some serious, painstaking work done in order to come to the right solution.
And when the Northern Ireland Secretary appeared before the Northern Ireland Committee, he said he was talking to the Defence Secretary about protections for veterans in future legacy processes. Have you been given any indication what those protections might actually be?
No, look, there isn't a firm solution that is on the table in front of us. So I look forward to receiving that. There were certain indications, but that really isn't constituting that firm finalised package that the likes of me would like to see. And I know that other members of the Defence Committee and other parliamentarians, in fact, would like to see. So we very much await that. And let us not get into arguments about or any misunderstandings and misconceptions, because the Director of Investigations for the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery, even it was intimated by the Director that the prospect of prosecutions against those who previously served was very minimal. So that's why we need to make sure that we do this in proper context and we respect the Good Friday Agreement. That is an absolutely incredible achievement. After the troubles, after the heartache and the terrorism and the death and destruction that was entailed during that troubling time, the Good Friday Agreement was one of the amazing achievements that we should all be very, very proud of. And that is what I would like to see, that this is very much one of the last pieces of the puzzle of that Good Friday Agreement, which I hope will receive widespread support as and when it is finally revealed to us.
So where do you want to see the balance being struck between protections for veterans and ensuring justice?
Look, as I said, it needs to be fair, it needs to be legal. That is incredibly important because previous solutions have been challenged in the courts, not just by individuals from one side, but both sides. Those veterans and their families, they want answers too. And that is why it is about having a serious, fair approach which can get respect from all sides and which is then a lasting solution.
And has the Defence Committee got an agreed view on that balance?
No, this is not something that our House of Commons Defence Committee has looked into, and I know that there will be differing opinions amongst all 11 members of our committee. The committee at the moment has no plans to delve into this because it's an area of legislation that the entire House has been looking at. The Defence Committee at the moment is undertaking inquiries, for example, into AUKUS, into the Afghan data breach, the super injunction and the Afghan resettlements. So there's a lot of work that we are currently undertaking, and this is not something that I can speak on behalf of the committee. I can only speak on what I feel personally, and that is why during my meeting with the Defence Secretary and with the Minister for Veterans and People, I reiterated that we needed to get a solution that had widespread support and respect.
And fairness and justice are largely uncontroversial ideas. It's turning them into reality that no one seems to be able to do at the moment in regard to this. When do you think there will be some resolution?
Okay, we all want resolution. And as you rightly said, we need justice for those victims and their families, people who've served. We need closure as well. And that is why this is painstaking work. I know that this is something that the Prime Minister addressed in Parliament as well on the floor of the House when he was questioned on it. So this is something which is very, very sensitive with respect to our nation's history. And if we get this right, it will have a huge impact on our present and our future.
Tandesi, great to speak to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Micah, it's 27 years since the Good Friday Agreement. Is the reality that this is intractable, that there is never going to be a solution to move on from the past where wrongs were done on both sides and wrongs were done to both sides?
Yeah, I mean, as Tandesi said there, this is the last part, the last element of the Good Friday Agreement. And it's really, really difficult to square this particular circle. Because I was thinking back as he was speaking to, in 1996, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which, after apartheid was a really important move. But you could have truth and reconciliation. Let's tell the truth, let's say what happened without fear, and then let's reconcile ourselves, accepting the truth. If you'd called it a Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, it wouldn't have worked. Because if you have justice, you're probably not going to have reconciliation. Yep. And so you can have truth and reconciliation, or you can have justice and truth, but you can't have all three together. And I think that's the nature of the circle that the government is trying to square in this. So the analyst in me says that it probably can't be done. The cynic in me says that as long as we keep talking about it and trying, it goes out of our generational experience. In another 10 years, there'll be nobody who was alive at the time to be affected by it. And it'll be a matter for the families who will feel resentful in different ways, but the force of that politically wears off. So the cynic in me says, as long as you keep trying, you're not going to succeed, but as long as you keep trying to address this issue, then that's probably the best you can do. And I hope I'm being overly cynical about that, but we've been around this so many times that truth, justice, and reconciliation are actually incompatible after a period of such bitterness, intercommunal bitterness.
But Mike, memories will remain, won't they? How important is it for the government to get it right?
It's very important that the government is seen to be sincere about this, as sincere as it can be, trying to get it right. Because for the morale of the armed services, they have to know that they will not be hung out to dry, years later for things that they did in operations for operational reasons at the time. So that it's really important that the government keeps on at this. They mustn't just walk away from it. But I think the process of talking about it is as important as a resolution, which I don't think they will come to. If they do, I give them absolutely full marks for that. Because going back on it, the Good Friday Agreement, as Tandesi said, was a remarkable piece of legislation. It was a remarkable piece of mediation. And a lot of people said it couldn't be done. But it was done. And of course, there are lots of rough edges. And of course, there are lots of loose ends. Most of them have been tied up, except this one. But it's really important that the armed services feel that we won't get ourselves into this situation again in the future. It's
at this moment, you really wish Mo Merlin was still with us, isn't it?
Sometimes, yes.
To finish this week, I just want to take us back briefly to that big Chinese military parade. Among the weapons displayed for the first time was the HQ-29 space defense system, missiles said to be capable of taking down satellites in orbit. In the last of our series on transformative technologies that could reshape war, we're looking at the weaponisation of space. Dr. Julia Barn researches space power at the Freeman Air and Space Institute of King's College London and teaches officer courses at the Joint Services Command and Staff College. She's been explaining how the nature of military interest and involvement in space has changed dramatically in recent years.
It really has been militarized since the beginning, since day one. And I think it's a really important distinction to make between the difference of militarization and weaponization. So what we're talking about is sort of our critical shift in so the paradigm of war is weaponization. There's sort of two categories that we can place space as weapons into, and that's kinetic and non-kinetic. So kinetic are things that go boom. This is perhaps seen as the most risky and unfavorable because they create debris in orbit. The effects are not reversible. So debris is not possible to clean up from orbit yet. The second category of space weapons is non-kinetic, and those are weapons that can disable, damage, or disrupt space assets without physically colliding with or destroying them. So non-kinetic has more reversible effects. They can use energy to damage or interfere with satellites through lasers or high-power microwaves. There's also electronic warfare, which is perhaps the most commonly used space weapon on a daily basis because of the ease of interfering with radio frequencies and also satellite signals. I always refer to spoofing and jamming. So jamming causes a receiver to die, spoofing causes a receiver to lie. But this non-kinetic category also includes sort of cyber weapons that target digital systems and control space assets, and electromagnetic pulse detonations, which could be either nuclear or non-nuclear, and they can sort of knock out electronics in orbit or on the ground. Some weapons are easier to get a hold of and easier to employ than others, similar to what we're seeing with drones on a battlefield, where sort of cheap and easy can deliver a profound effect.
Thanks. That's really interesting. Can you just talk me through the potential advantages of a weapon in space? What capability could it give that can't actually be achieved on the land or in the air or in the sea domain?
When it comes to seeing space today as something that's being employed on a battlefield, we're seeing it as sort of the first mover advantage. So being able to disrupt eyes and ears on the ground. So being able to make sure that your force can fight with reconnaissance, with communication structures is kind of fundamental to modern warfighting. So attacking those structures is a way of gaining advantage in sort of the earliest moments of war. And so we saw that with clues in Russia's war in Ukraine that can kind of guide us into the future where, space systems get targeted first before troop movement. That kind of disable those advantages as a first line of effort. So you can disable either global surveillance, precision targeting, missile warning, communications, all which are sort of essential to modern warfare. So space is both the domain where you can conduct sort of warfare in and also warfighting, but it's also one that kind of enables other domains. And so there's a way in which you can gain advantage by targeting space systems as both an enabler, but also a domain.
And in terms of space warfare and capabilities, are we there, or is it still mostly in the realm of theory?
Yes, so I think we're already there. The most fundamental aspect to note is perhaps the ways in which it's been employed on a daily basis. And so we've seen non-kinetic weapons used every day. To give you an example, which perhaps would enlighten this, is just recently on June 15th, there was an oil tanker that was Liberian flagged called Front Eagle. It was navigating near the Strait of Hormuz when it received a false GPS signal that misdirected its navigation system. So as a result of that, the vessel collided with another tanker, it caused a fire, and investigators were able to trace this back to an interference in sort of the energy weapons near Iran's Bandar Abbas region. But these are textbook examples, for example, of non-kinetic space-based interference that we see quite frequently on a daily basis. And this signal interference is a pervasive tool across the world used by many different countries. So this non-kinetic weapon use is something that happens quite frequently.
How easy or difficult is it to hold countries to account when they use non-kinetic warfare in space?
It is quite difficult because it happens so frequently. It's a similar thing to the cyber domain. And I tend to also reference this when it comes to living in a London flat, where you can never really have zero mice in your flat. You can lessen it. You can have maybe one mouse that stays in one corner of the house, and same for cyber attacks. You can never really have zero. So when it comes to non-kinetic use, it's really difficult to get to a zero line where there's no employment of non-kinetic warfare or this kind of interference. But the most sort of fundamental aspect that I'd note is the inability to distinguish civil versus defense utility of assets. Everything's multi-purpose now in space. It kind of blurs the attribution of escalation, and it raises some questions about whether, if a private satellite's hacked, jammed, or spoofed, who's responsible? Is an act of war? Should governments be responsible for their private actors? Should they retaliate? So with industry growing as a legitimate military target, commercial satellites can be attacked or disrupted if they aid in military activity. And we saw this with Starlink in Ukraine, for example.
And you've given us examples of non-kinetic attacks from space. Have we seen kinetic space weapons used yet? Are they already up there?
Yes, well, they're also on the ground. So probably the one that's most profound is we've seen sort of direct descent ASAT tests. So a direct descent anti-satellite test sends up a kinetic kill vehicle from ground to space. The sort of most profound example of that was with China in 2007, because it created the largest debris field. We cite that as sort of creating 3,000 pieces of debris, but there's over 30,000 pieces of untrackable debris. But there have been more sort of kinetic attacks since then. So 2008, Operation Burnt Frost by the US, 2019 by India. And then also recently, sort of Russia had also had an ASAT test that created 1,500 pieces of debris. But since then, so since that test that Russia had conducted in 2021, there has been a movement in the US called a DA ASAT test ban, so a direct descent anti-satellite test ban, which is a use of norms to sort of establish a way of mitigating the use of direct descent ASAT tests, because there's sort of this deterrence by environmentalism per se, where you want to make sure you can have access to the domain and use it. So destroying it and creating debris is deleterious to sort of everybody operating in orbit. So we've seen norms emerge that have provoked and sort of prompted a movement towards less use of kinetic warfare and less use of those kinds of weapons.
And what can you tell us about the weapons that are being developed now?
A lot of them are ambiguous. I think perhaps that's the most defining characteristic of the weapons that we're seeing in orbit at the moment. It's hard to establish whether or not something is a weapon until it's being employed for a specific use or not. We've seen sort of the development of maneuverability in orbit as one that's probably the most contentious, whether or not it's China that is sort of maneuvering a satellite close to other satellites, dragging a satellite into a zombie orbit and back, or sort of Russia, which has recently sort of demonstrated the ability to sort of give birth in orbit, this sort of Matryoshka doll phenomenon where you can birth a smaller satellite from a larger satellite, undeclared. This activity isn't necessarily an act of warfighting or a weapon. It could also just be a demonstration of science, but it's hard to know specifically what that's being used for or what it could be used for in terms of potential.
And if we come back to the conventional domains of land, sea and air, militaries are increasingly relying on digital technology. Do space weapons have the capability to render that entirely useless, to take battlefields back a century, for example?
Potentially. I think I'm cautious to speculate about sort of rendering us useless in a modern world. I think there are contingency plans, but it would be a massive blow. And I think we're seeing that in the recognition of doctrine at the moment, where space is getting put into more of a center place. And so more funding is being allocated to this, but also more sovereignty. So making sure that you get access to your systems, data, critical data, but also making sure that you can sort of employ and use those assets to be resilient in all other domains.
And what would a space conflict look like today, and what might it look like in 10 or 50 years' time?
Like I said earlier, space conflict has to consider the principle that war can be conducted sort of into, through, and from space. There's a whole host of capabilities there, kinetic, non-kinetic, from ground to space or from space to ground, that states can use to employ in order to gain sort of advantages in the earliest of days. So there are clues from Russia's war in Ukraine that can guide us into the future. I think China will consider similar tactics when it approaches Taiwan. But given that space systems are targeted first before troop movement, it makes it clear that disabling those advantages in space are the first line of effort, and we will certainly see that in the future. Control of space enables global surveillance, precision targeting, everything that's foundational to modern warfare. But without that control of space, there's the ability to sort of neutralize or blind opponents' entire command and control systems in those early minutes. So space is really the first front, not the last resort. And we're seeing also the targeting of civilian systems to degrade military performance, so pulling private actors into conflict zones and also sort of changing the character of war there. But I suppose I would just say that every conflict has a space dimension, even if it doesn't reach orbit.
And at this stage, is there a space superpower?
That's a big question. I think it depends on who you're asking. In terms of who's employing the most sort of resources in space, I think the US is undeniably at the top slot. The ability to launch quite cheaply and also the sort of number constituting satellites in orbit. We're seeing the ability to impact modern warfare coming from the US. A lot of states are developing postures around being allied by design, with the US quite central to that. At the moment, the US is, I suppose, what you'd call a superpower in space, but there's a lot of effort to sort of contest that. China's poured a lot of resources and energy into that. And it will be defining in the next sort of chapter where Russia is able to reconstitute its assets or if it remains to be a declining sort of power in space.
Dr. Julia Baum, great to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mike, I think space feels intangible to a lot of us as a domain, but we got another reminder this week just how much the big powers are putting into it. The move of US Space Command from Colorado to Alabama was seen as meriting a major announcement by President Trump.
Yes, because, I mean, President Trump understands, as the Americans understand, that they've got to stay ahead. As Julia Baum was saying there, the US is ahead in these respects, but it's got to stay ahead. And the other thing that she said there, I mean, two things really. She said, you know, in terms of anti-satellite warfare, we've been talking about it for years and years, but we're there. We've arrived at it now. It is a reality. And as she said, space is not the last resort. It is the first front. It is the place where a war or military conflict will be fought first, in the first minutes. And for that reason, the United States knows that it can't let its dominance slip, even though it will be under severe pressure. So I think, you know, that's a positive statement, the Alabama operation, and moving it to Alabama. All of that, I think, is to the good in general of trying to preserve space as a domain that can't be completely neutralized by Western adversaries in the early minutes of any confrontation.
And on that thought, we shall leave it for this time. Thank you, Mike, and thanks to all of our guests. That is all for now. We'll be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. In the meantime, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news on our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.